It's a pleasure and an honor to be part of this really impressive conference. It's quite amazing, the number of people that come every year to in this group and to talk about these important issues. And it's terrific to have the opportunity to provide my perspective on the theme, the ever-changing terrain of attitudes towards immigrants and refugees, a topic I've been putting some effort into of late. As we all know, internationally, Canada is widely seen as a beacon of tolerance when it comes to the acceptance of immigrants and refugees. I think this was burnished in the last few years with the acceptance of a record number of refugees from Syria. But here in Canada, and all of you, we know the picture is much more complicated than that. Not everyone here accepts or supports current immigration levels, and newcomers all too often face discrimination because they stand out. And many believe that the terrain, such as it is becoming worse. We certainly heard that from Kamal this morning. And it certainly has in other parts of the world. So the question then is, what is happening in Canada? And do we still deserve, or perhaps ever deserve, the reputation that others attribute to us? So I'd like to address this point through the evidence provided by social science research, and specifically public opinion research that Environics has been conducting going back several decades, called Focus Canada, to provide some evidence to make the point. I'm going to start with just a bit of historical perspective, touch very briefly on demographics, and then characterize for you the so-called terrain of attitudes about immigration and refugees in this country, historically and up to recent time. And by recent time, I mean just in the last few weeks. We've just completed our most recent Focus Canada survey, and you will actually be the first people to see the results, so stay tuned. So in the few minutes I have, I want to address two questions. How accepting are Canadians of immigration and the country's growing diversity? And two, how is public opinion changing in light of recent developments both in Canada and elsewhere? But first, a comment about our history. We know, but easily lose sight of, the historical fact that Canada as a country started with colonizers and settlers, coming to a land long inhabited by Indigenous peoples, successive waves of people arriving, displacing, and building something new. Not always framed as immigrants, that term only was coined in the 17th century and not really used until the early 20th, and it was in the early 20th when the current narrative about immigrants really arrived. And this may be an obvious point to belabor here, but I point it out because there is a tendency of some people, perhaps no one in this room, to see immigrants as add-ons, extra people who are not like us, and perhaps people we don't want or need. But really, as we all know, Canada can be described or defined as a country of continual addition of people. Just to show you some data from Stats Canada, this gives a historical trend of both the number and proportion of people who were immigrants from 1903 to the present and projected another 20 years. And the trend line is pretty clear. The number of immigrants and the proportion of the population is going up steadily and will continue to do so. And as Kamal noted in his talk, we are now at the point, or we were in 2016, where all of the population increase, all of it, is now reliant on newcomers and Indigenous peoples, and primarily the former because of numbers. If we weren't welcoming a significant number of immigrants to this country, Canada would start be looking like Japan, which is a country that is rapidly aging and now having a shrinking population. And those of you in larger cities know pretty well that there is an increasing diversity, particularly in our urban areas across the country. Nationally, more than 4 in 10 Canadians are first or second generation. And in some cities, like Toronto or the GTA, it's 80%, Vancouver 70%, and even cities like Victoria and London, where we may not think of them as diverse cities, are increasingly becoming more so. So this is the demographic reality of our country. Regardless of what we may think of it, we are becoming an increasingly diverse place, and that will only continue to be more so. So the question is, how are we as a people and a society responding to this change? What is the public sentiment? Let me start with, again, with some history, just to point out that, like other countries, Canada has a very established legacy of racial intolerance. Here's some survey findings from a 1946 Gallup poll showing that just after World War II, a significant number of Canadians did not want people coming from certain ethnic and racial groups. 1960s, 1961, a little more advanced perhaps in our democracy and values perhaps, but even then a majority of Canadians wanted to maintain current restrictions on immigration from non-white people. And even into the 1980s, so not that long ago, a significant proportion of Canadians believed at the time that there was too much immigration to this country, and relatively few supported acceptance of political refugees who might not otherwise be accepted. And I picked 1983 because it happens to be just after the time that I myself came to this country from the US. So it's a significant date of sorts. Of course, I was privileged not to look like the typical newcomer, so I did not experience what many others do. So this is really sort of the past. What is really remarkable is that opinions really started to change, and quite dramatically, after that point. Some of you may have seen this chart before. We've showed it many times. Environics has been doing surveys with Canadians since the late 1970s, and a number of surveys we've asked the same question each time. Do you agree or disagree there's too much immigration in Canada today? And what we can see is in the 80s and 90s, a significant proportion, a majority, said that yes, there is too much immigration. And then it started to change, and quite dramatically. So by perhaps 15 years ago or so, that had actually flipped. And now, and continues to be, a clear majority of Canadians reject that premise. And if you can read the slide, and over to the far right, I guess, you're right, you will see data from our October 2019 survey, just completed about 2 weeks ago, showing that 63% of Canadians disagree, and that number has actually ticked up over the last year. So this is a very significant social change, and has been consistent despite the economic downturn 10 years ago and various other events. One of the reasons why immigration levels are not an issue is that most Canadians believe that high levels of immigration are not a threat to their jobs or do not have a negative impact to the economy. So we can see from this data that for much of the past 20 years, a strong majority agree with this statement that the economic impact of immigrants is positive. What about refugees? So another agree-disagree statement, or trend data. Do you agree or disagree? Too many refugee claimants are not legitimate. If you go back a number of years, you can see that a significant majority of Canadians agreed with that statement. There was a concern about the legitimacy of some people being accepted. But look and see how that trend line has declined over time, to the point where just a few years ago, people were more likely to disagree than agree. And that has basically maintained itself. So again, you can look at this and say the population is divided roughly 50-50 in terms of views on this issue. But put that into the historical context, and put it in the context of the so-called populism and all of the other trends today, and I think it's actually a good news story. The biggest concern that Canadians have about immigrants is about integration into society. Some immigrants, some types of people, maybe not all, aren't quite fitting in and becoming Canadian enough. So here we have a question in data that show this, going back about 25 years. Do you agree or disagree? Too many immigrants do not adopt Canadian values. Clearly, a majority of Canadians have some level of concern, whether it's significant or moderate. But again, we can see that if you go back about 10 years or so, that level of concern has started to diminish, and today is as low as it's been in 25 years. So again, it's divided opinion. It doesn't mean this isn't an issue, but looking at historical terms, we're seeing a positive trend. And on the issue of integration, I want to show this slide from a 2016 survey we did with Muslims and non-Muslims across the country. And we asked everybody on the survey, what are the values that are most important for immigrants to adopt when they come here? This was an open-ended question, so we did not give them these categories. They had to volunteer what they felt about this. And the basic point of this slide is that Muslims, 70% of whom are immigrants, and non-Muslims essentially agree on what's important for immigrants to do when they come. Language fluency, respect for others, respect for the law, knowledge of history and culture, and so forth. So in fact, at least this data provides some evidence that in fact many newcomers come to this country and they have the same aspirations to be Canadian in the way that perhaps people here a long time have been. And I think another important trend is that increasingly Canadians are starting to embrace this notion of diversity and welcoming others as part of the country's image. Here are results from surveys that we've conducted asking Canadians what the most important contribution they feel their country can make to the world, an open-ended question. And what we can see is that the blue line is going down as peacekeeping. It used to be the stock response that Canadians would give when you ask this kind of question. And recently, in our most recent survey, it was multiculturalism, diversity, welcoming refugees. So increasingly, this is how Canadians are starting to see their country. Thank you. And if we put Canada within an international context from the Gallup World Poll in 2018, of OECD countries, Canadians are most likely of people in all these countries to say that their city or area is a welcoming place for immigrants. And just also another international comparison, a survey we did earlier this year in Canada and Germany, asking about the benefits of immigrants to one's country. We could see that Canadians are much more likely than not to think that immigrants are benefiting the country. Germany, which does stand out as a country that has really stepped up in recent years to accept, I believe, 1 billion refugees, a very significant number. Germans are much more ambivalent about the refugees and the immigrants coming to their country. They know they need them for economic reasons, but they're not sure about them coming and being in their country. It's a very different culture. So I think these comparisons only take us so far, but I think it's important sometimes to look at our experience in the context of other places. One other thing I want to show you before I conclude, excuse me. I haven't had time to get into differences within the Canadian population on these attitudes, and Antoine, I think, will cover some of that. But one important trend is important to point out, and that is the increasing political polarization of immigration as an issue. And what I'm showing you here are results of our question about immigration levels over time across people that support the 3 main national political parties. And what we see is that back in the 1990s, people supporting these parties basically agreed on this question about too much immigration. But over time, there's been a division where supporters of the Liberals and the NDP have continued to hold more progressive opinions about immigrants, and conservative voters somewhat less so. This also applies to the question about integration and adopting Canadian values. You can see that NDP and Liberal supporters have increasingly become less concerned about this. Conservative supporters, it's been maintained. And even the question about the economic benefits of immigrants. While a majority of conservative voters today think immigrants are good for the economy, it's much lower than for supporters of the other parties. So let me finish. So what can we draw from this? You know, newcomers have always been a contentious issue in this land, in this country. So this is really nothing new. Who should be here? Who's legitimate? Canada has undergone a significant transformation over the past few decades in terms of how it answers these questions. There is nowhere near a public consensus on these questions here. Some people are on one side, some are on the other. So there really isn't common agreement among everyone. And there continues to be divisions, as we've seen. However, I believe we've passed a critical threshold in this country in terms of our social norms, our political discourse, and our public policy. And I think this recent federal election has provided a critical litmus test to this. There are many people, including myself, who anticipated that immigration might become a key election issue and might become a wedge issue intended to divide people. It did not happen. And it didn't happen because all of the main parties realized that this was not a winning proposition to do this for one reason or another. The People's Party did make a bit of an issue of it, and it gave them no traction. And I want you to consider this in the context of the success of anti-immigrant parties in other Western countries. Because I didn't keep up with this. So my last slide, what we take from this. You know, I make these conclusions, which I think are fairly positive in the context of this conference, but want to acknowledge that there's no basis for relaxation or complacency. I think you in this room know better than most people the challenges in communities across the country, and that these data points, as valid as they may be, don't necessarily reflect the circumstances on the ground where you are. So there's much that's problematic how Canada and Canadians deal with this issue. But I think that I'd suggest that we pay attention to the larger picture and not let the specific problems, the negative media attention, the naysayer pundits obscure what many of you and others have accomplished in this area and continue to do so. We have a terrific foundation to build upon, and Canada, I believe, has earned its international reputation as a beacon of acceptance in a world that, for the most part, is beset with real serious problems. Thank you.